Good evening, and welcome back to the Foundation Year program of the Center for Applied Theology and your local urban abbey. Tonight we will be discussing Neoplatonism with priest and academic Dr. John Simons, former principal of Montreal Diocesan Theological College at McGill University in Montreal. It is my pleasure to introduce Father Simons, not only because of the weight of scholarship he brings to our discussion tonight, but because it was under him that I first studied for ordained ministry back in the 1990s. He was, in fact, my principal, as I was privileged to attend Diocesan College, or Dio as it is still called, at a time of great theological ferment. And while I have said it to him in correspondence before this evening, I can only say it again now. I'm truly thankful that he saw fit to see me graduate. Looking back on so much of what I said and did, I'm not so sure I deserved it. In any case, it is a genuine delight to have Father Simons with us tonight, and I'm sure I speak for more than myself when I say that I'm looking forward to learning from him. In light of which, I will put it to Lucy to ask our first question.
Thank you, Father James, and it's lovely to virtually meet you, Dr. Simons. So the first question is, Plotinus, as most of us hopefully know by now, is considered the founder of Neoplatonism. But Plato died in the year 347 BC. We then have a 600-year, more or less, gap before Plotinus appears. He's born in 205 AD, but he doesn't actually start writing until he's what most of us would consider middle-aged, I think around 50 years old. So presumably Plato was read and interpreted by many philosophers in that 600-year period. And then indeed there are some names with which those viewing or listening may already be familiar. If I say Plutarch or Atticus, we've probably heard those names or read them. So what then is new about Plotinus's Platonism, not only with respect to Plato's own teaching, but also with respect to Plotinus's predecessors in the Platonic tradition?
Thank you for the question. Plotinus did not think of himself as an innovator. He had no intention of adding anything new to Plato's teaching. Instead, he thought of himself as restating and explaining what Plato had already taught. Of course, he did his explaining in light of the philosophies that had arisen in the years after Plato. So, not surprisingly, he felt the need to address criticisms of Plato and also to address new developments, especially on the part of Aristotle and the Peripatetics, as his followers were known. So Plotinus incorporates and modifies Aristotelian concepts as well as those minted by the Stoics. But his intention is always to restate what he takes to be Plato's authentic teaching. We might suspect him of being a bit disingenuous on this point. For example, Plotinus's teaching on the three principles that are foundational to reality: the one from which all things derive and which they seek, the intellect or divine mind, and the soul. This teaching is something new, not found in Plato, at least not as such. There are hints in some of Plotinus's predecessors to these principles, but they're not developed with the same probity or thoroughness in them. According to Plotinus, what's basic in reality is unity. Unity, as opposed to, say, being or subjectivity or matter of some sort. And this primacy of the one has implications for the soul and its destiny, and indeed for every level of reality. The primacy of the one is hinted at in Plato. It's picked up in the Platonic tradition, but it's to Plotinus that we owe sustained reflection on its implications. I'll say more about that later. For the moment, I'd like to indicate briefly how the other two foundational principles go beyond anything Plato has to say. For example, Plato's famous for his theory of the forms, or ideas, as they're also known. He posits, as you know, a fundamental divide in reality between being and becoming. The forms comprise the realm of being. They are, intelligible, unchanging objects, while this world of everyday experience is the realm of becoming, where everything is always coming to be and never is, as Plato puts it in the dialogue Timaeus. Things in this world have a measure of being, however, because they participate in the forms. They reflect the forms, just as images in a mirror reflect objects present to the mirror. The being of sensible things is an image being. The assertion of this basic division in reality is shared by all Platonists, and Plotinus is no exception. In the late Platonic dialogues, however, there's evidence that Plato saw the need to revise his understanding of the forms. For example, he asks whether it's adequate to think of them only as objects, and suggests that there must be life and motion in the intelligible realm. So Plotinus picks up on this suggestion and locates the forms in the divine mind, where they're not external objects presented to God's gaze, as it were, but rather they are living thoughts, the living thoughts of the divine intellect itself. Indeed, in thinking the forms, the divine intellect thinks itself. This is not in Plato. Also, in order to secure the identity of thinker and thought in the divine mind, Plotinus has recourse to Aristotle's thesis that knowledge is identical with its object. Knowledge is identical with its object. At the level of everyday experience, if we truly know something, it becomes part of our mental outlook, we might say. It enhances our being as cognitive agents, Aristotle would say. And his thesis is that in the case where the mind that knows exists separately from matter, and the object it knows is likewise free of matter, knower and known are one and the same in being. The point here is that an Aristotelian thesis helps Plotinus formulate his doctrine of the second hypostasis, which we might say is a remake of Plato's theory of the forms. So above or within all things, there is the one, turned toward it, circling around it, Plotinian images. There is the divine intellect, which Plotinus calls the one many. Then there's the soul. In the Timaeus, Plato gives us an explanation for the existence of souls. Souls endow bodies with life and reason, which is a good thing, because in this way, the sensible world is adorned with a perfection it would not otherwise have. As it happens, it's not only human bodies that get to have souls. The stars have their own rational souls, as does the sensible world as a whole, and even the earth. Some of this is standard teaching among Platonists, but Plotinus goes beyond it in positing another soul that is not an individual soul, but soul itself, so to speak, from which all individual souls derive, and of which they're parts. This is the hypostasis, soul. It should not be mistaken for a form. The relation of a form to its instances in the sensible world is that of a model to its various imitations. Individual souls, however, are not images of an ideal soul. They are parts of soul, and thus dependent for their being on the whole of which they're parts, and which includes all other souls. So as souls, we are quite literally all in this together. Now, the job of soul is to create this sensible world according to a rational structure based on the ideal world of forms. Our individual souls have a critical role here because they're entrusted with caring for our bodies and thus contributing to the order of the whole cosmos. But the soul linked to a mortal body can also get absorbed in material pursuits, and to such an extent that it forgets its true dignity. It forgets its sisterhood with other souls. And I use the term sisterhood sisterhood here advisedly, not to be politically correct, but because that's Plotinus's own term for the community of souls. Anyhow, when the soul forgets its origin, that's when it gets in trouble. That's when we get in trouble, when we identify ourselves uncritically with the limited perspective our body imposes on us, and when we take on the needs and wants, the fears, the griefs, the resentments of this individual bodily existence, as if this were all there is to us, that's when we get in trouble. So we have the one many, and soul, which is one and many. So perhaps that could suffice as a quick overview. I hope to develop what Plotinus has to say about these three principles, but first a caveat. The term hypothesis, used of the one, or intellect, or soul, has a resonance with Christian readers of Plotinus because it's the same term used by the Greek fathers to designate the three persons of the Trinity. The hypostases of Plotinus, however, should not be confused with the persons of the Trinity, for reasons that should be clear, I hope, from the very cursory outline I have just given. Plotinus does not have a doctrine of the Trinity, at least not an Orthodox Christian doctrine. So to sum up, Plotinus does give a new spin to the philosophy of Plato with his doctrine of the three primary realities, the one, intellect, and the soul. So although the term Neoplatonism is an invention of modern scholarship, there is some justification for it. So I'll stop there.
Thank you.
If I could jump in, I'd like clarification on that last point, because I think when Christians read Plotinus for the first time, they're really struck with his idea of the Divine Triad, and we can't help but see within it, the one, the intellect, and the all soul. We can't help but see the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So how is it that they are different? And then just to add on to that, Neoplatonism, or Platonism generally, Father Plant and all his fellow members of the Society of Those Who Love Plato in Cambridge, they can give off the impression of being, in a way, kind of coldly philosophical. Whereas when you read Plotinus, it's kind of this vibrant religious vision. Like it isn't just, Neoplatonism is about thought, not about love. But when you actually read it, you realize this is all about love. This is all about, anyway, you get my question, I think.
Right. Well, there are some important differences, I think, between an Orthodox doctrine of, a Christian Orthodox doctrine of the Trinity and the notion of the three hypostases. If the suggestion you're making is that Plotinus's doctrine of, that his doctrine is so imbued with love and devotion and desire for the one, that it must be religious in inspiration, if that's the point you're making, then I think one would have to say that these ideas are they're not actually borrowed from a cultic or a prophetic tradition, certainly not in Plotinus. The answer is emphatically no, they're not religious in inspiration. Plotinus doesn't see himself as reliant on or indebted to a divine revelation. Certainly those who formulate the doctrine of the Trinity in the early church do so on the basis of the revealed acts of God in history and in Christ. And Plotinus doesn't teach a way of salvation either, if by salvation we mean deliverance from death and from the perils of the afterlife, assuming there is one. The philosophers, whether Platonist Aristotelian, Pythagorean, Stoic, whatever, they traditionally taught that the goal of philosophy is to help us mortals live wisely, to live as happily and as best we can in full knowledge of the limitations of our condition. So notice that knowledge, let's call it wisdom, that knowledge comes by the exercise of reason. It's not by faith, it's not by rehearsing myths or by participating in sacrifices or rites designed to please the gods or to solicit their protection. The philosophical enterprise, the exercise of reasoned argument, allows us to appreciate, I would say in the fullest sense of the word, to come to know the principles and causes of things and of our place in the cosmic order. To acquire that knowledge, or at least to make a rational assessment of its possibility, is to live well. Now, to live in accordance with reason requires getting over or getting beyond the limited perspective imposed on us by our bodily existence. Our rational faculty enables us to see things from a wider objective perspective. But our ability to attain such a perspective is threatened by the seductions of those self-centered and often conflicting passions that inevitably accompany bodily life and cloud the mind. So it's important to cultivate the virtues if one's to be guided by reason and come to a contemplation of the truth. Self-control, courage, that is, the resolute acceptance of our mortality, justice, the right ordering of our faculties, all these strengths of character, these virtues, are necessary if we're to get beyond our self-centeredness and rise to the level of contemplation. And this is the goal: contemplation, beholding the bright countenance of truth, in itself the most desirable human activity. One might say, therefore, that contemplation is our salvation, in the sense that if we attain it, we're delivered from ignorance and from the painful consequences of living in ignorance of ourselves and of the big picture of which we're part. I would emphasize, however, that this contemplation is achieved through philosophy, which includes the notion of love, the love of wisdom, and not through participating in sacred rites, and not by divine intervention. And yet, I mean, having said that, it must also be said that there is a theological dimension to contemplation. Perhaps Aristotle puts it most clearly when he wonders in the first book of his Metaphysics. He wonders whether the kind of knowledge we seek is not beyond human power. He says the kind of knowledge we seek, that is, contemplation of the highest causes and first principles, is divine. Not only in the sense that God is a kind of principle, and therefore an object of contemplation, but also in the sense that God is the sole or chief possessor of this sort of knowledge. It's not surprising that in this climate, Plato would endorse the opinion that the goal of human existence is to become like God, so far as this is possible. Not surprising that Plotinus would repeat this counsel. The interesting thing is Plotinus carries this notion of becoming like God even further. It's not simply the case that the soul may become like God by engaging in a divine activity, namely contemplation, all the while remaining distinct from God. No, in Plotinus's own words, the soul becomes like God by becoming one with the divine and seated in it, by becoming one with the divine. When he writes of the soul becoming one with the divine, he seems to have in mind its ascent to the level of divine intellect, rather than to the level of the one. It would be misleading to suppose that the soul achieves this union as an outside observer, so to speak, as an isolated center of consciousness, transported, unchanged from this everyday world into the divine mind. better to think of the ascent as a shedding of everything that separates my mind from yours and that of others, and therefore to think of the ascent as an expansion of perspective, as well as a unifying of consciousness, and so as coming to a higher level of selfhood. We who exist as individuals in this sensible world are not, as such, divine. My mind is not the divine mind, nor is yours, but there is a higher part of me and of you that does exist in the intelligible world. And through philosophy, we can awaken to it. Note that in the treatise on the three primal hypostases, it's Aeneid 5:1, in chapter 10, after naming the one, intellect and soul, Plotinus says, "Now it must be admitted that as these three are in the very nature of things, they are also in us." In other words, the hypostases are not objects apart from us. Rather, as one scholar has put it, they are niveau du moi, levels of the self. As these three are in the very nature of things, they are also in us. So I'm drawing here a sharp distinction between philosophy and religion, between loving and pursuing wisdom on the one hand, and on the other, seeking salvation by means of divine assistance. I should say, however, that in antiquity, this distinction was not viewed as a hostile opposition, as it came to be under the aegis, I suppose, of modern thought. Jewish Hellenists and Christians, as you've pointed out, had little difficulty in drawing on the vocabulary and the speculations of the philosophers. They did so not uncritically, I would add. As for Plotinus, he had no axe to grind against the practice of religion. He is really irked by the Gnostics. He wrote a treatise against them. I should perhaps say, parenthetically, that Gnosticism is not a religion per se, but a kind of elitist, and I think deeply pessimistic spirit that infiltrates Judaism and Christianity with elements borrowed from Plato, as well as from Oriental myths. In any case, Plotinus is critical of the Gnostic devaluation of the sensible cosmos, which he blames on their misreading of Plato. There's evidence that Plotinus was largely indifferent to popular religious practice. For example, there's a report in his biography that when one of his disciples tried to persuade him to participate in ritual worship of the gods, he refused. He said, "It is for them to come to me, not for me to go to them." The same indifference to ritual can't be attributed to his successors, however, some of whom saw Gnosticism and Christianity in particular as threats to the cultural heritage of the ancient world. Porphyry, Plotinus's biographer, who reports the incident I just mentioned, Porphyry wrote a treatise against Christianity. Perhaps more interesting was the wedding of Neoplatonic doctrine with pagan ritual, an integration no doubt adopted as a way to compete with Christianity, which had not only a narrative of salvation summarized in the creeds, but a liturgical enactment of that narrative, a sacramental proclamation and reception of a salvation in principle accessible to all. We find this wedding of ritual and Neoplatonic doctrine in Iamblichus, Porphyry's student, according to whom union with the gods is not brought about by thinking alone. He uses the term theurgy to describe the divine work of ritual, which he says is needed to achieve union with the gods. One scholar tells us this term, theurgy, was coined in deliberate contrast to theology, which merely talks about the gods. The idea is that the virtues and philosophical reason are not enough to bring about union with God. We also need something like sacraments. In the Christian case, material things like water, oil, bread, and wine, these are means of our communion with God when we use them in a particular way, invoking God's promise to claim us and to unite us with himself through them. In the case of Iamblichus, the methods, we're told, were essentially those of ritual magic, methods based on the premise that the material world mirrors an invisible divine world. I can't see, that Plotinus himself would have been terribly sympathetic to Iamblichus's innovation. He was aware of the popular appeal of magic, but denied it could aid the soul's return to the divine. Contemplation, he says, stands untouched by magic. So the short answer to the question, is Neoplatonism religious in inspiration, is no. It's continuous with the philosophic quest for wisdom, which relies on reason. Is Neoplatonism hostile to religion? The answer must be a qualified no. I mean, it depends on the religion and on the particular Neoplatonist. There's no doubt about the existence of the divine, though notice divinity or deity is located at different levels. It isn't the case as it is in the prophetic tradition of Judaism and in Christianity that all deity is gathered in the one God is worthy of the name. When it comes to religious ritual, Iamblichus is more enthusiastic than was Plotinus, evidently. Now, as to the question, can Neoplatonism inspire and inform a religious or spiritual outlook? Well, as a matter of historical fact, it has. So the answer is surely yes, and it may indeed have influenced, as you suggest, the Christian fathers of the patristic era. I'll stop there.
So I'll continue if that's okay. If the Neoplatonic picture of reality is based on reason rather than on a religious inspiration, what arguments are advanced in its favor? In Aeneid 6:9, for example, Plotinus says it's by the one that all beings are beings, and he supports this claim by saying that nothing can exist unless it is one. So intuitively, that seems true, but isn't the inverse also intuitively true? Couldn't we just as easily claim that nothing is one unless it exists? In other words, to be and to be one seem to amount to the same thing. They're convertible statements. It's difficult to see, therefore, on what grounds Plotinus prioritizes unity over being.
Well, there are some missing premises in the argument Plotinus presents in Aeneid 6:9. His intention seems clear enough, namely to argue that the one is not to be identified with the soul or with intellect. He assumes his hearers will know what he means by soul and intellect. That also perhaps presents a difficulty for the uninitiate. Notice that he identifies intellect and being. The second hypostasis, nous, the Greek word for it, or intellect, is equally the realm of being, that is, of the really real, the beingly beings, to translate literally. In other words, the realm of Plato's forms. In any case, having established the transcendence of the one with regard to intellect and soul, the remainder of the treatise, 6:9, is concerned with the question as to how we may think or speak of the one. But to return to the argument for the one, the missing premise is the Platonic principle that every multiplicity is reducible to a prior unity. Or, as translated by Stephen McKenna, once there is any manifold, there must be a precedent unity. Every multiplicity is reducible to a prior unity. That's the principle that impels Plato to posit the forms in the first place. So perhaps I could just review it, I hope briefly. In the early and middle dialogues, Socrates is mainly concerned with moral and aesthetic questions. What is courage? or justice, or beauty? People give different answers to these questions, but surely there must be one definition of justice or beauty if our use of these concepts is to have any meaning and to provide us with a standard by which to judge particular claimants to the name. What is it about beautiful things, for example, that attracts our attention and elicits our admiration, draws us out of ourselves? There are beautiful faces, beautiful pieces of music, beautiful souls. What is it that makes these many things one, at least in respect of beauty? As is well known, Plato said there must be some one thing that satisfies the definition of beauty and that in some ways present to our souls, enabling us to recognize beautiful things as beautiful when we encounter them. This one thing, call it the form of beauty, cannot be present as such in its instances because then it would not be one. It would be divided and so multiple. So what we're looking for is the one form that is variously reflected in its many different instances. The form of beauty, therefore, must be separate from the various beautiful things we encounter in experience. It must exist in some sense apart from them. Not spatially apart, of course, but separate in the sense that it has a different mode of existing. That means it can't be numbered among the many it is meant to account for. If it were numbered among them, then we'd have a new multiplicity, whose unity we would have to account for by positing yet a higher form of beauty. To avoid this regress, we must affirm the form of beauty to be one thing, self-gathered, as it were, and it must exist on a different level, in a different way, from the beautiful things that reflect it. Notice also, this one thing, the form of beauty, can't be something that, happens to be exceptionally beautiful. No, it must be beauty itself, without admixture, pure, intelligible beauty, ideal beauty, essential beauty. As Plato puts it, it is auto kath auto, beauty itself according to itself. It's the very being of beauty. And this is true of every form. Each form is the very being or essence of a multiplicity exhibiting a common feature. Okay, now consider we may apply this logic to any multiplicity we encounter in experience. Must there not then be a world of forms corresponding not only to values and ideals like justice, beauty, goodness, but also to items in nature? There are evidently many different human beings. Shouldn't there be a form human being, the one essence of humanity in which we all share, and in virtue of which we are different from cats or cattle or carrots? Shouldn't there be a form for every other living thing too? Plato's a little vague on the extent of things of which there are forms. Plotinus not so much. Let me quote one of his descriptions of the world of forms. Since in our view this universe stands to that as copy to original, he's saying since the world we live in, the sensible world, stands as copy to the original, which is the intelligible world of forms, the living total must exist there beforehand, that is, in the world of forms. That is the realm of complete being, and everything must exist there. There no indigence or impotence can exist, but all must be teeming, seething with life. All flows, so to speak, from one fount, not to be thought of as some one breath or warmth, but rather as one quality englobing and safeguarding all qualities. Sweetness with fragrance, wine quality, and the savors of everything that may be tasted, all colors seen, everything known to touch, all that ear may hear, all melodies, every rhythm. This is Plotinus's description of the world of forms, a world of pure intelligibility that pre-contains in a single wholeness, as it were, everything available to our senses in this world. So, getting back to the Platonic principle that every multiplicity is reducible to a prior unity, at the level of the forms, we now have a new multiplicity. Notice, a multiplicity of pure intelligible objects. Hence, the realm of forms must likewise be accounted for by something prior to it and transcendent, some one thing that exists in a different way from the forms themselves. Notice that every form is one, the one beauty, the one justice, and so on. What do these ones have in common? Unity, evidently. Hence, the unity that is prior to the forms will be unity itself. It will not be the unity of anything, not the unity of the cosmos or the unity of the world of forms. It will be simply one. Notice that this one will be above being or beyond being, because being is located at the level of the forms. Each form is the being or essence of something. And the realm of forms is the realm, therefore, of thorough and transparent intelligibility. But just as beauty itself is not just another beautiful object, so the one is not another intelligible object. It's not a determinate form like beauty itself or justice itself. An important consequence is that it cannot be grasped by the mind. It's certainly not an object of sense perception, nor can it be defined by reason, because that would involve locating it within a relational network, stating how it's the same as some things and yet different from them. Nor can it be an object, because it's not an intelligible object. So the one transcends description, definition, intuition. There is, of course, a paradox here. The paradox is that the logic of the Platonic argument for the forms, that is, for the things that are most real and knowable, leads inevitably to the requirement that there be a principle that transcends being and knowability altogether. Reason, as it were, requires the existence of the one, but reason cannot grasp what it must posit. Much of Aeneid 6.9 is concerned with the question posed by this paradox. How can we even talk about the one? Or in what sense can we know it? In chapter 4 of that treatise, Plotinus says, "The chief difficulty is this: awareness of the one comes to us neither by knowing, nor by the pure thought that discovers the other intelligible things, but by a presence transcending knowledge." He then goes on to say, "If nevertheless we speak of it and write about it, we do so only to give direction, to urge towards that vision beyond discourse, to point out the road to one desirous of seeing." In other words, our talk about the one can only gesture towards it. The value of our talk about the one will not lie in any descriptive or representational accuracy we may pretend to ascribe to it, but rather in its capacity to orient us towards what we cannot, in principle, describe or represent. Now, students of theology or of mysticism will recognize here the so-called via negativa, the way of negation, or to give it its Greek name, the apophatic way. The apophatic way is a way of speaking about what is, strictly speaking, unspeakable. We cannot say what the one is, but we can say what it is not. First and foremost, that it is not many. There's no multiplicity in it. Hence, it's incomposite, simple. We should also say it's not finite. That is, it's not limited in being, not limited to being this rather than that. Indeed, it's beyond being, though obviously not beyond in a spatial sense, since that would limit it to being in one place and not another. The via negativa entails thinking about the one in paradoxical language. For example, as Plotinus says, the one is absent from nothing and from everything. Presumably, it's absent from nothing in that nothing could even be without the one. and yet it's absent from everything because it's not to be numbered among the many. Circulate throughout the whole realm of beings, and you will not find it. So, in denying various predicates of the one, we do not succeed in saying what it is, but we thereby gain a sense of an indefinable reality that exceeds our cognitive powers. I'll stop there for now.
You mentioned there paradoxes, and there seems to be quite a bit of this in Plotinus' text. But could it be that these paradoxes rest on a supreme paradox, which is potentially fatal to his whole doctrine? If we follow the Platonic logic, we are compelled to posit the one as the first principle. But this principle turns out to be beyond description, and it is beyond description and intellectual intuition, because it is pure, featureless unity. We cannot say what it is because it has no whatness. What then distinguishes this supreme principle from nothing? Aren't we bound to come to the paradoxical conclusion that in the end, everything is reducible to nothing?
You're quite right that the via negativa implies we cannot say what the one is, and that's because it has no whatness. That is to say, it has no essence or form that would distinguish it from other essences. A cat is a cat and not a dog because it participates in the essence of cathood or felinity, which, at least in its own mind, makes it superior to other creatures that are defined by their sadly imperfect essences. I learned this from my cat when he was with me. Plotinus denies essence or form of the one because if it were a form, it would exist on the same level as the other forms and so could not account for them as their principle. Also, every essence is limited to being what it is and not something else. If the one were a form, it would be this and not that. But Plotinus is saying the one is neither this nor that. Now, does that mean, as you suggest, that it is nothing at all, a blank emptiness? In Aeneid 5:3, Plotinus writes of the one, we say what it is not, but we do not say what it is, so that we speak about it from what comes after it. We speak about it from what comes after it. To speak about the one from what comes after it is to indicate its status as the principle or cause of everything else. Hence, we can ask what follows from its being the first cause or principle. Well, for one thing, it must be self-sufficient, not dependent on anything else for its reality. Instead, everything else depends on the one, not only for existence, but for the fulfillment and perfection of its being. The one is therefore the highest good, and Plotinus frequently refers to it simply as the good, and identifies it with Plato's form of the good, which in the Republic is said to be beyond being. For Plotinus, of course, to be beyond being is to be beyond form, so he obviously understands Plato's terminology in this case according to what he takes to be its intention, rather than its literal meaning. In fact, Plotinus is willing to say a fair bit about the one, and we may wonder to what extent everything he says is consistent with the via negativa. For example, in Aeneid 6:8, he attributes a kind of thinking to the one. Now, strictly speaking, the one cannot be a thinking thing since thought requires an object. If the one has an object in mind, then it's complex. It's not the one. And this is the reason, of course, Plotinus gives as to why the second hypostasis, nous or intellect, cannot be the first principle. Thinking is the activity of intellect, not of the one. But in 6.8, Plotinus wants to ascribe something like a transcendent thinking to the one. He calls it hypernoesis. He also ascribes will and substance to the one in this treatise, though he qualifies these attributions by saying he's departing from correct thinking for the sake of persuasion. And he frequently uses the word hoion to characterize his positive statements about the one. Hoion could be translated as kind of or quasi. The one has something like will or intellect, but not will or intellect as we normally understand them. That seems to be what Plotinus is saying. Of course, this way of talking about the one may not be inconsistent with the via negativa. If the one is utterly simple, nothing we attribute to it can be a property added to it or a quality it possesses. If we say the one is will, then that's what the one is simply. Think of it as pure freedom, unconstrained by anything external or even internal. We ascribe will to the one only in order to avoid misunderstanding. In fact, this seems to be what Plotinus is up to in this particular treatise. He wants to set aside a characterization of the one that demands we make a choice. Either the one just happens to exist, in which case chance would be the first cause. Oddly enough, this seems to be the position of some postmodern Christian theologians who suggest that chance is another name for God. Serendipitous creativity is how one of them defines God. But this is clearly inconsistent with Plato. I should think it's also inconsistent with the mainstream tradition of Christian thinking about God. On the other hand, if the one doesn't just happen to exist, it must exist necessarily, which implies it has a nature that dictates it cannot not be. This is the position of some defenders of classical and neoclassical theism in our own day. God is a, or the, necessary being in virtue of the divine nature. But again, this way of thinking is inconsistent with Plotinus's position that the one does not have an essence or form that determines how it has to be. The best way to get out of this logical quandary, the one exists either contingently or necessarily, is to think of the one as pure freedom. As a rule, I think it could be said that when Plotinus seemingly predicates something positive of the one, it's in order to deny any defect in it. Hence, it's an extension, really, of the via negativa. Let me just pause there.
That's great, thank you. I'm going to jump in now, just to save us running out of time, because I think probably our participants will have their own questions and we'd like there to be time for them to ask those. So I'm going to come in. So Plotinus talks a lot in his treatises about the one and about how an individual soul might achieve union with that one, which really lends the texts quite a mystical flavour. Nevertheless, a mere surface reading of them does reveal a bias towards intellectual contemplation over any kind of practical or aesthetic creativity. But I'm sure you'll agree that we are more than intellectual beings. Our interests are manifold and don't simply revolve around achieving a comprehensive scientific or philosophical theory. So while expanding the boundaries of knowledge might be the remit of scholars, we aren't all scholars, and so there must be other ways of making a difference in the world and living meaningful lives. Does Plotinus offer any guidance here?
Well, there is a sense in which Plotinus could agree that there is more to our lives than the pursuit of intellectual understanding. Even so, for him, contemplation of the forms is the best and most blissful life possible for a rational being. Not only that, but contemplation is built into the very fabric of reality, that is, of everything that derives from the one. At the beginning of Aeneid 3:8, which is on nature, contemplation, and the one, he says that all beings are striving after contemplation, not merely those endowed with reason, but unreasoning animals as well, even plants and the earth that begets them. Now, he says he's only joking when he makes this suggestion, but it turns out to be a serious joke. How can natural things like trees and flowers be said to contemplate when they don't have the cognitive apparatus for it? The short answer is that they don't contemplate in the same way that beings endowed with reason do. I should have mentioned that the intellect's contemplative activity, vis-a-vis the one, produces the forms. Soul's contemplation of the forms is productive of the sensible world. So the productive activity of nature that occurs in flora can be looked upon as an imitation of the contemplation that occurs in souls and intellects. Nature's activity is productive in the sense that it generates and maintains living non-rational beings like trees and flowers and so on. And in so doing, nature, which Plotinus says is a power of the soul, contributes to the creation and maintenance of the sensible world. Now, in rational beings like ourselves, contemplation is not simply the imitation as best we can of a divine activity that remains above and beyond us. It's an inner awakening to a higher level of our own selfhood. But this contemplation is not all there is to us. One of the reasons why Plotinus introduces the hypostasis soul is to account for the creation and governance of the sensible world. And why is soul necessary? I mean, why can't it simply be the case that the forms are reflected in matter and so constitute the world of becoming? The answer is that intellect just on its own can't account for the existence of the sensible world. The sensible world has a rational, elegant structure. Hence, its actualization requires a different kind of thinking from the thinking of the intellect. In the intellect, the forms are a co-inherent plenitude. If there's to be a sensible world imaging this fullness of being, the forms must be combined and separated in bodies and in relationships between bodies. Of course, the forms themselves are not brought down to the level of sensible things. They remain transcendent. But the soul thinks about how the forms might be expressed and displayed in a spatio-temporal universe that best images the intelligible world. That kind of thinking is rational, practical, and aesthetic, but no less divine than the thinking of intellect. It's different from the thinking of intellect, of course, which is non-discursive, intuitive. Let me try an analogy. When I see the face of someone I know, I see it all at once. I recognize the face immediately without having to ask myself where I've seen that nose before, eyes that color, that forehead, and so on. This kind of holistic immediate recognition is analogous to the intuitive knowledge of being that intellect has. But now suppose I decide to draw the face before me. In that case, I have to think about it differently. I could draw a caricature or a photographic style likeness or an impressionistic one. In other words, I have to decide what kind of a likeness I'm going to draw. What kind of a likeness will best express the essence of my subject. And so I have to think how to arrange on my tableau the parts of the whole face that is present to me. Now, though the soul doesn't deliberate as we do, the kind of thinking it engages in to create and govern the sensible world is, as I said, rational, practical, and aesthetic. The soul's thinking is aimed at rendering an excellent image of being. Now, unlike the one, or intellect, soul has a concern for what comes after it. Not only does it contemplate the forms which are above it, it orders them in patterns that can be instantiated in bodies and reflect the beauty and goodness of being itself. Arises all its parts. So, for example, our human souls will not only aspire to union with God, but will take responsibility. Although he doesn't have a word for it, I would suggest this soul task implies caring for our material environment, beautifying the world that we live in. But it might take us off topic here to try and argue that point. In any case, this twofold function of soul is reflected in our own psychological makeup. On the one hand, Plotinus claims our higher soul is in the intelligible world, engaged in uninterrupted contemplation. We're not normally aware of this higher aspect of ourselves, but because our lower soul, the seat of everyday consciousness, is busy in the sensible world. This is a perfectly legitimate occupation for the soul. The body as such does not represent a threat to the soul's well-being. There must be bodies that have souls to care for them and adopt their perspective. If a sensible world is to exist at all, think about it. A sensible world that existed only as a kind of plan in the mind of the divine craftsman would not be a truly sensible world. If there's to be a sensible world, there must be not only bodies, but sentient subjects associated with those bodies, equipped with the necessary, sensory and emotive apparatus to perceive the world and make their way within it. And as I just suggested, and to make it an excellent image of being. Anyway, this means, that in order for there to be a world that reflects the magnitude and goodness of the intelligible world that already exists in the divine intellect, there must be a sensible world like ours inhabited by souls that are involved in it and contribute to its wholeness. Do I have time to conclude here? Have I gone on too long? I've gone on too long, haven't I? I've gone on too long.
Well, we do have questions that are coming in from the audience. If you'd like to tackle those.
Sure. Okay. I'm sorry to have gone over my time.
Not at all. Not at all.
Don't apologize. It's marvelous.
In which case, we'll turn to Father Tom Plant and ask or invite him to come forward with the first question.
Yes, I'm the cold rationalist whom Father Harris pointed out earlier on. If so, then I've totally misrepresented my position, because I find in Plotinus moments of great warmth and heart, and indeed flights into poetry. He's not afraid to quote, if not religion. He's not afraid to quote poetry, of course. Particularly Homer. But I compared with Aristotle, I think that he's very far from the cold rationalist. But perhaps that's just showing my biases. So a question then, I suppose. When we talk about the hypostasis, perhaps a cold rationalistic question, when we talk about the hypostases, the nature of the divine, it seems to me that there's a question here of where you draw the line between created and uncreated, really. Clearly, for the Christian, that there is one being, but one essence, one ousia, shared by the Trinity, if we're looking at Eastern thought, which may be a being beyond being, of course, of which the three hypostases are all, well, can't really say any more than hypostases, can we really? Whereas within the Platinian triad, there seems to be an ambiguity over where you cut that off. Now, okay, there's a clarity in that the one is the only thing that is uncreate, as it were, and that the intellect and the soul are, to some extent, created. They're generated from the one, and therefore they're subordinate, and then all things participate in them as they participate in the one. But even so, there's a kind of dotted line beneath the triad, between the triad and everything else. Is there not? So
yes.
Is there more than a question of just where we draw the line? I mean, I know that, you know, the logos cannot just be translated onto the intellect, because in fact in Plotinus the logos is somewhere in the soul, and so on. But I wonder, but anyway, now I'm going on.
No, no, not at all. Well, there is a definite line to be drawn between the hypostases and the sensible world, the world in which we live. The world in which we live, the sensible world, is not an hypostasis. It's a creation. If there's a creation in Plotinus, that's where it occurs. It occurs through the activity of the soul contemplating the forms and planning, rationally planning, a world that will image it, that will imitate it. So this world, the sensible world, exists only because of the creative activity of the soul. And that creative activity involves that souls be incarnate as well. Okay? Souls have to be in bodies in order for there to be, as I was saying just recently, in order for there to be a sensible world. You don't have a sensible world unless there are souls that can sense that world. So they have to inhabit bodies and care for that world. So in fact, you know, creation is something that occurs not only through the divine craftsman in Plato, the demiurge, who in the Timaeus creates the world, is in Plotinus, the nous and the intellect. They are two aspects, as it were, of the divine craftsman. The soul being the soul of the divine craftsman, who creates a sensible universe in imitation to be an excellent copy of the world, of the universe of being itself. So there is clearly a line there. You know, the three foundational realities are the one, intellect and soul. The sensible universe is not itself an hypostasis, and its imitation of the transcendent world, the divine world, is an imitation that never succeeds in imitating, as it were, because things are always coming to be and passing away. And the everlastingness of time could be looked upon as a kind of imitation of the eternal contemplation that occurs in the divine realm, the intellect contemplating the one, soul contemplating intellect, or the realm of being. But that, no, you were suggesting that there is a kind of line between the one and derivative hypostases, and indeed there is. I'm not sure that creation is the right word for it.
No, sorry, it's the wrong word, actually, quite clearly, but yes, yes.
Yeah, but there, I mean, it's clear that the derivative hypostases are not created by the one. I think what we could say is that what the one gives is the power for intellect to create itself. That's what comes from the one. The one doesn't, in fact, diffuse itself into what is other than itself. There is an act outgoing from the one, Plotinus says, but he also speaks of this act reverting towards the one. So there's not only procession, there's return. And it's through that dynamism, which is not a temporal dynamism, through that dynamism of procession and return, that intellect constitutes itself. And similarly with soul, soul derives from intellect through contemplating the forms. Although, you know, there's scholars have pointed out that the dividing mark between intellect and soul gets blurred an awful lot in Plotinus.
Yes, thank you very much. And perhaps later I might be able to ask a bit about theurgy as well.
About what? Sorry.
And perhaps a bit later I might be able to ask about theurgy, depending on other questions, and, and look at the sacramental ideas as well. Thank you.
You may have that option sooner than later, Father, but I'll just check with the crowd. Are there any other questions? Okay, I see Lewis. Go ahead, please, Lewis.
Hello, Father. I'm trying to work this out, and I'm come with the question. Give me 2 seconds. So at the beginning, you were talking about the way the divine intellect orbits and encompasses the one, and to sort of talking about just and answering Father Plant's question, the creation comes out of the creative activity of the soul. And I'm hearing all of this, and kind of, you know, the opening to the Gospel of John feels like it's echoing in my head. And I'm wondering, you know, particularly statements like the first 3 verses, in the beginning was the Word was with God, everything came into being through him. But also like a verse like verse 18, no one has ever seen God, it is God, the only Son, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known. Is there crossover, like, or are these totally different worlds that aren't meeting each other? Does that question make sense?
Yes, yeah, makes a lot of sense. I doubt very much that Plotinus read the Gospel of John. Of course, the Gospel of John would have preceded, chronologically speaking, Plotinus's lecturing in Rome in the middle of the 3rd century. Did Plotinus have any acquaintance with Christian doctrine, with particularly with the doctrine of the Logos Christology, which develops even before Plotinus in the 2nd century of the Christian era? Did he have any acquaintance with that? There doesn't seem to be much evidence for it. I mean, his use of the word logos seems to be dependent upon its use within Stoicism rather than within Christianity. Now, there are those who've argued that when the 4th evangelist wrote his gospel, he used the word logos. He borrowed it from a Hellenistic environment, but who precisely he borrowed it from, I think there's debate about that. There are others who suggest that the logos that the author of John has in mind derives from really a Jewish biblical background and shouldn't be likened to the Hellenistic, particularly the Stoic understanding of logos. But I think there is a kind of, nonetheless, there is a kind of parallel here in that in the Gospel of John, the Logos, who is in the beginning with God and who is God, is an expression of who God is, no? And that Logos is, in the life of Jesus, an incarnate expression of who God is. Logos, as used by Plotinus generally, it's a little more complicated in Plotinus, but logos usually is the expression at a lower level of a higher entity, a higher unity of being. A logos is an unfolding, as it were, at a lower level. So if that's the case with Plotinus, then I think my understanding, at least, of the Gospel of John, and maybe not so much of the Logos Christology, but the Logos doctrine in John seems to be that the Logos is an expression of God in a mode apart from God's transcendent otherness, but which is not less than God. I mean, when Jesus in the 4th Gospel speaks his prayer, what is it, in John 17, it's in another part of John's Gospel too, where he prays to God the Father and prays that he may return and share with him the glory that they both knew before the foundation of the world. There's a suggestion there that the Logos, who is present in Jesus, was present with God in eternity before his incarnation, before the Logos became flesh and dwelt among us. So the Logos definitely belongs in John to the divine realm. But I think the Logos in John is more closely divine, more clearly divine than, say, Logos, as Plotinus uses it, can be used in various ways. He doesn't have a doctrine of the Logos like that of John, I don't think. Perhaps there are others, though, who know about this, who can add. Are there others who can say something about that? Who studied Logos Christology?
It's been a while since I read Grillmeyer, so I'm going to opt out of this one. Is there, Father Tom, did you want to jump in on that?
I'm not going to put up my hand for that very specific aspect. No. Are there other questions though? Did you? Are you asking me if
I see Scott Wheeler actually has a question here, so I'll call on Scott at this point.
Understand the description of the structure of, let's call it the universe, but what I haven't followed is where the sense of ought comes from, that one ought to contemplate, that this is what things strive after. How does that follow?
I'm sorry, I had difficulty hearing that question.
Right.
Let me try to repeat what I heard, and that is, you were wondering where the sense of ought comes from? Yes. The sense of obligation to contemplate? Is that the question?
Exactly, yes.
Well, I think Plotinus would say that contemplation's going on whether you want it to or not. It's a spontaneous activity. For us human beings, you might say, well, look, we need to be encouraged to engage in contemplation. And I think Plotinus would agree with that, because in fact, we can be so distracted from contemplation. We can be distracted in a way that, as it were, cancels our consciousness, our awareness of a contemplation that is always going on and that characterizes our higher self, as it were, our higher soul. It's interesting because Plotinus does say that, I mentioned that in the sensible world, we're occupied with our bodies and with material pursuits and so on. But Plotinus says that we also have a higher soul that is always involved in contemplation. And this is perhaps a claim that sounds highly implausible for us. There is a plausible Platonic account of the need for souls to be embodied, which I have already gone over. On the other hand, the claim that the higher part of us always exists in the intelligible world and is always contemplating, even though we're usually unaware of it, probably strikes most of us as implausible. Without, entering into a discussion of the issues that are involved here, perhaps I could mention that the Church's scripture makes a similar claim. Perhaps it's not similar enough, but you remember where St. Paul writes to the Corinthians, and he says something to the effect that for we know that if our earthly house, this tent, is destroyed, we have a building from God, which is eternal in the heavens, a house not made with hands. The apostle seems to be talking in that text about bodies rather than souls. We inhabit a mortal body that will be destroyed, but this is not all there is to us. That's what this text seems to be suggesting. We have another body, eternal in the heavens. Does this mean we exist at two levels? As Plotinus suggests, we exist in this world and we also exist in the intelligible world. In Paul's case, is he saying we exist as mortals in this world, but also that there is an immortal part of us? I don't know. I mean, perhaps that heavenly body that he's talking about here is not ours, but Christ's glorified body, which is ours only insofar as we are members of him. I recall Hilary Armstrong, a well-known Plotinus scholar, who in fact is the translator of the Loeb classical library translation of the Aeneads, that he says that in Christian thought, it is Christ who corresponds to the true self of Plotinus, that is our upper soul, our higher soul, that is always engaged in contemplation. I think that's, an interesting connection to make. So when it comes to this question of why ought we to contemplate, Plotinus's answer would be, well, we can't help but contemplate. We're already contemplating. The task that we have as denizens of the sensible world is to cultivate the virtues and not to get too involved in material pursuits or in the kinds of pursuits that will distract our mind and make us forget who we really are. Does that help?
Thank you, yes.
Great. Thank you for that, Scott. I think I'm just doing a quick scan. I don't see any other desperate hands up except one. So I'm going to actually ask Fullerton Plant if he would pose the final question for the evening, simply because the conversation has been so invigorating. It's covered an easy 90 minutes so far. So Tom, if you would bring us to a close with your question.
If there's nobody else who wants to ask, I don't want to hold, grand, fine, yeah. It's interesting that the understanded soul aspect of Plotinus' thought, which later Platonists thought of as an heretical position. In fact, I think Plotinus was such himself, didn't he? I mean, Proclus totally writes that off, and Iamblichus talks about the soul being entirely incarnate and doesn't leave a bit hanging, as it were. In some ways, this perhaps it leads on from the last question about, yes, we must contemplate the good because it is good, and because that's our purpose, and indeed all things are contemplating at all times. And yet there's no, when you ask the question how do we rise to that which is beyond being? How do we lift our mind beyond intellective reasoning, beyond the body, the material realm, beyond the soul, beyond the intellect, to the what is it, amecha non kalos, or whatever it is, the sort of the being beyond being, the inconceivable beauty. Well, how? And therein we have something of a problem, which I think links back to what we were looking at last week, where we were looking at Augustine's Confessions, but also links forward to what we're going to do with Dionysius a bit later on in a couple of weeks, because last week we learned that Augustine read the Platonists, whom we assume to include Plotinus, and through something of their practices, presumably, as well as purely reading, had some intuition of the divine beyond reason, and yet found its fullness within the body of the church, thanks to St. Ambrose, presumably definitely through the sacraments and through the Christian life. And yet Augustine himself he shares something of Plotinus's ambivalence, to say the least, about the body and the material realm, and totally rejects the idea of theurgy that you mentioned earlier, almost magical practice. Plotinus's disciple Porphyry also firmly rejects theurgy. Plotinus does, maybe, but theurgy and Iamblichus, coming back through Dionysius, that seems to offer the way, doesn't it? So that we don't have to necessarily ponder dense Platonic texts all our lives. Rather, we can receive what the divine is working, theurgy, what God is doing through the sacraments, through the material realm, through the body, indeed the body of Christ, and God does that work for us, which seems to be quite Augustinian as well as thoroughly Dionysian, but in its way a natural extension from Plotinus. I'm trying to draw things together and failing to ask a question, but I wondered, what do you make of all that?
Well, I think that's a wonderful argument for grace. Yeah, how do we go about awakening to that divine part of us, the soul that is always contemplating? I have a suspicion that Plotinus would say, well, just read what I've written. You know, he's a lot of what he writes is intended to be an aid to help his hearers, because he gives them his lectures, first of all, presumably, and his writing is intended to refocus the attention of his hearers and readers towards the intelligible realm and towards the one. Yeah, I thought you said that he wasn't unsympathetic to theurgy, but I have the impression from reading him that he would be.
Yeah, sorry, I think he would be, and we can say that he was from Porphyry, but he's not. Yes. He doesn't say much about it himself, does it? I mean, he shows no sympathy for it.
Yeah. Yes, and of course, the pagan Neoplatonists have to compete with Christianity, and theurgy, it seems to me, in any case, is an innovation. It's certainly a departure, I think, from Plotinus's philosophy that draws, Neoplatonism in some way closer to Christianity. You don't have to rely simply on theology. You don't have to rely on contemplation. You can participate in the sacramental life, and that's wonderful. That's perhaps the grace of the Christian gospel that accounts for the fact that today, it's Christianity rather than Neoplatonism that is the sort of culturally available religion for most of us in the West.
I think it's a wonderful way to draw things to a close. But it's been a delight to have you, and I do hope that you'll be able to join us for further conversations, both as part of this series, but in others as well.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted that you asked me to do this, because it forced me to, I have been doing a lot of reading in Plotinus recently, but it forced me to begin to bring together some of my thinking about it. So thank you very much to you, and I've enjoyed being part of it.